talk is going to begin today. So first off, I'm Gideon Marcus, and I was chosen to do this presentation because I live in the past. Quite literally, I live in the past. So I blog 55 years ago, and I write about it like it's today. And I write about the science fiction, and I write the space shots. So the stuff we're covering 55 years ago is all the stuff that led up to this. So today, this is a very important thing that happened. But today we're going to talk about how we got there, what it meant for us, and where we're going today. Because obviously we haven't been on the moon in a long time. I'm going to talk a little bit about why. I guess we can start. Are we live?
Yeah, we're live. You want to turn down the lights?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do this thing. All right, how we got to the moon and what happened after. So, question is, why did we even go to the moon in the first place? It was kind of an accident, not what we meant to do. Let me tell you how it started. This may surprise you. These are Nazis. If you're wondering why I'm starting with Nazis, it's because these Nazis, aside from doing a lot of terrible things to some of my relatives, they also did a very interesting thing. They invented, especially this guy here, invented this. Now there had been rockets before this, but this was the first operational rocket of warfare with a range of more than 100 miles. And what the Germans did with this rocket was they built hundreds of them, thousands even, based them on the coast of occupied Europe, and aimed them at England. Now that doesn't sound like it has much to do with the moon, except what happened was, after the war was over, there was a whole crew of German scientists under a guy named Werner von Braun. That was this guy. And after the war, there was a race between the Americans and the Russians, and they all went into Germany, and they tried to get as many, it was like Pokemon, collect them all. They got as many German scientists as they could, and then took them home. And Russia got about half of them, we got about half of them, and he was one of the ones we got. Now, what does this have to do with going to the moon? Well, this very quickly evolved into this. This is a Soviet missile. It has one job. Its job is to carry several megatons of nuclear explosive in the nose from somewhere in the Soviet Union to somewhere in the United States and kill millions of people. I don't know how many of you lived through the Cold War, but it was a scary time. And those of you who did not live through the Cold War have no idea what that is. But there was a time when we were scared that any day someone could push a button and everybody would be wiped out. We built little shelters underground. We had drills. We had what they call duck and cover drills in school where an alarm would go off and we'd go under a desk and we'd hide ourselves. Not me, I'm not that old. But people who remember the Cold War lived through that. These days we have what? Terrorism. What else do we have that's scary?
Earthquakes.
Justin Bieber. I mean, we have scary things, but I don't think anything has approached the magnitude of this period of time. And it was thanks to this, which in many ways is just an upgraded version of that other rocket we saw. All right, but there's something else you can do. When you have the ability to send a big heavy payload from one country across the world to the other side of the world, you can put something else on top. You can put something that doesn't kill people. And you can put something that has enough velocity behind it, enough speed to actually go above the Earth and stay above the Earth and continue to fall around the Earth without actually hitting the Earth, and that's called an orbit. And in 1957, that's what the Soviets did. They launched the very first artificial satellite called Sputnik. And Sputnik didn't do very much except beep. But that beep was enough to scare the United States because if the Russians could put in a grapefruit that could beep, then their next rocket might send in a person with a camera. And the next one might send bombs into orbit that could drop whenever they wanted. And so when this happened, this was a call to action to the world, and the race was on. But at the time, we didn't know where the race was going. We just knew that the Russians were in space. We had to be in space too. This is what we did. This rocket was a lot smaller, and also designed by that guy we saw in the Black Sea. This is a Juno 1 carrying Explorer 1, which is the United States' first satellite. And what's cool about that satellite is it did more than beep. It went into orbit and it found that the Earth is surrounded by this super deadly radiation layer called the Van Allen belts. Those Van Allen belts are crucial to understanding why we get these pretty aurora up at the North Pole, why sometimes you turn on the radio and you get nothing but static. We discovered that. Go team. So at this place, this is 1958. We still don't know where we're going in this space race, but we know we're in some kind of race. We've got to beat the Soviets to wherever they're going. All right. Well, where the Soviets were going is sending a person into space. So this is what the ship they were working on looked like. See the big sphere? It's designed like that. So here's the little engine that lets it maneuver in orbit. Here's all the propellant tanks that fuel the engine. And this is where the guy sits. He's got this nice big roomy capsule. And when he's ready to come back, he fires his little retro rockets, and he comes back to Earth on his back. And it's nice and spherical, because that way it falls straight, and all the fire on the back of the ship goes off in all directions. They could afford to have a nice big heavy spacecraft like that, because they had their nice big heavy rockets. Our rockets weren't as big. This is what we had. We had a cool looking space plane. And for a while, we were talking about strapping rockets to this thing, and sending it into orbit, having him fly around the Earth once, and then come land back on Earth. There was only one problem with this strategy. It couldn't work. This guy would have burned up in the atmosphere, and we would have had a going up, not come down situation. So we didn't do that thing, as cool as it looks. Instead, we did this. So you'll notice, same sphere, except we only have a tiny little part of it. Why? We didn't have a rocket big enough to carry a full sphere. So instead, we have a little piece of a sphere. But same kind of idea, right? He's sitting here, there's a retro rocket, we've got a little parachute here because otherwise he wouldn't land. And the difference between us and the Soviets is they would land on land because they had a really big country. We landed in the water, which was probably safer. We also had a really big navy, which the Soviets didn't have. So we were geared for water landing, they were geared for land landing. So now the race was really on, right? We're sending up rockets, we're sending up satellites that go beep beep and other things. But now it's a race to who's going to get the first person in space. And then the first question is, who's going to be that person? So these are the people who were selected to be the first Mercury astronauts. Now you might wonder how they got that job. You might be wondering how you guys can get that job. So they got this job because originally NASA was like, all right, who do we want to be in this spaceship, to be in the vacuum of space, alone from everybody else? Maybe they'll go crazy up there. No one's ever been in a place where there's no gravity. We need scientific-minded people. We need people who can think fast on their feet. It'd be nice if they knew how to fly. So NASA was coming up with all these recommendations. Maybe we should have women, right? We should make it open to all humanity. Maybe we should even have like amputees because they're smaller and use less oxygen. And there were all sorts of it. Maybe we want people who were in Antarctica bases because they were used to being in isolated, harsh environments. And then Eisenhower, who was the president at the time, said, you know what, we're going to make this real easy because you eggheads can debate about this forever. We're just going to use military test pilots because we know they check all the boxes. And yes, it does exclude people. It excludes all the civilian test pilots. It excludes women. Even though there were plenty of women pilots, none of them were in the test pilot program at the time. But we're in a hurry, so we're going to do this thing. And so these were the 7 who were chosen. These hunky guys, especially this guy, I want this shirt. And at the time, nobody knew who was going to go first. They all had more than 1,000 hours of flying experience. Several of these people had flown in wars, either the Korean War or World War II, because those wars weren't that old. They were all good at their jobs. And this guy especially had it made. This is Gus Grissom. You notice he's the least tall of the astronauts. That is a virtue when you were crammed into a little spam can. All right. So, by the way, as I said, women need not apply, which didn't mean that they didn't try. So there were 13 women who were all qualified jet pilots, and they lobbied Congress and said, hey, look, give us a chance. And this is one of them. Unfortunately, they were turned down, and women would not enter the space program for decades. But that's fine, right? Because it's not like the Soviets were going to launch a woman or anything, so we were sure we were safe. All right, this is what the Soviets were launching. They were launching dogs. They were launching dogs in orbit. By 1960, they had sent up several dogs. Now, if you're an animal lover, you will not like to know that some of the dogs did not make it back. But many of them did. And in fact, the first space dog, Laika, had kids before she went up. And one of them was presented to the president at the time, John F. Kennedy. So Khrushchev had one of these puppies. John F. Kennedy had one of these puppies. These puppies eventually had kids. And they were the space dogs, and they were in the Kennedy family. I think they may still have space dog descendants in the Kennedy family. It's pretty cool. Love story across the ages. All right, so the question is this. It's 1960. We've picked our astronauts. We've got our space program. The Soviets have picked astronauts, presumably. Presumably they're not just dogs. And they have their spacecraft. So the question is, who is going to win? Who's going to have the first person in space? The Americans have the first Mercury in space. Isn't that great? Victory for America. That's the astronaut. This is Ham. He's a little hairy, forgot to shave, and he's kind of small, which, you know, that's a good thing for a Mercury astronaut. So unfortunately for us, this is who we got up. And before we could launch a person, this happened. April 12, 1961, the Soviets made history again, just 4 years after Sputnik, by sending up the first man into orbit, Major Yuri Gagarin. He went around the Earth once. Now, here's a little interesting tidbit. You may not know this. He technically didn't make it. So the rule is, you not only have to fly up in your spacecraft, go around the Earth in your spacecraft, but you have to land in your spacecraft. He didn't. They weren't sure if he could survive the crashing into the ground part of the flight. So what they did was they had him eject. All of these cosmonauts had to know how to parachute. And that's what he did. You have this spacecraft coming down, it's on a parachute, and he jumps out of the hatch, which to me is a pretty impressive move. Right? More impressive than just landing with it, right? When I fly to New York and come back, I prefer to stay in the plane. He came down separately. The Russians kept this a secret for years, because otherwise they wouldn't have gotten in the record books. So technically, while this guy did go around the Earth and scared us all, he technically didn't win. Well, who did win? Well, this is what we thought their spacecraft looked like, because they weren't showing us. All right, this isn't a joke. There really is a person on this one. So the next month, Alan Shepard goes up for a total of 15 minutes. He doesn't even make it into orbit. And that's because this rocket was weak. It couldn't do more than put a guy put in space for 15 minutes. I don't know about you, but 15 minutes is not that long. I take longer in the bathroom every morning. It's probably TMI. But my wife knows. So he made it. This is Alan Shepard, first American in space. He was weightless for all of 5 minutes. But the really sad thing is he really had to go to the bathroom because he was on the launch pad for 8 hours and it had 4 cups of coffee. They came up with a super scientific solution to this because they didn't want to let him out, right? He's on the launch pad, they're ready to go, and he's ready to go. They came up with a super scientific engineering solution. They let him pee in his spacesuit. He went into orbit. Right now you can't see it, but they're going to have to clean the deck. True story, sorry. This is the glory of space travel. Okay, so wonderful. America's in the space race, and we know that we kind of made it, right? Because we went up and down in our own craft. And our president at the time was cocky. Because up to this time, we didn't know where we were going, right? We knew we had to go somewhere, but we weren't sure where. And John F. Kennedy, our youthful president, is younger than I am at the time, and I'm only 36. No, he was only in his early 40s at the time, and he made a very gutsy maneuver. He threw his hat over the fence, as we say. He said, "We are going to put a man on the moon before this decade is out and bring him safely back to Earth."
Good job.
Thank you. And all of a sudden, America had a goal, right? People have been looking at the moon for decades, for centuries, for millennia. Since we have been definably human, we have wondered what that big shiny ball up there is. There were all sorts of theories. A few hundred years ago, we kind of figured out that it was a big rock. And it's the closest rock. So it makes sense that that's our goal. But think about what this requires. This is our planet, right? It's going to be the actual sizes here. This is our planet. This is the moon. This is a long ways away. And orbital mechanics are complicated because it isn't like you just go and you go in a straight line. The Earth is pulling you. The moon is pulling you. The sun over there is pulling you. This is super complicated stuff that requires a lot more than just some of these. It requires thousands of people and the first computers. So to say in 1961, after we'd sent a guy into space for 5 minutes, to say we're going to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. That was a really gutsy thing. Now, of course, who do you imagine that President Kennedy turned to make this happen? That's right, our friend, the Nazi. So, just remember that our past is a little bit intertwined with less savory things. So this is von Braun, a little older, and he was tasked with making the biggest rocket ever. At the time, the idea was we would make this enormous rocket, way bigger than anything we'd ever built before. And we'd stick a moon probe on it, and we'd stick a little lander on it, and we'd send the whole thing to the moon. Extremely heavy. And the thing is, when you're talking about weight is money. Weight requires you to have the biggest rocket you can have. And that rocket is shooting out millions of gallons of thrust and fire. And just carrying this rocket, just getting it to the launch pad, you would have to build like these giant canals just to get it to Florida where it can launch. So they decided this wasn't the way they were going to do it. They were going to come up with a different way to get it in orbit. Instead, they were going to use littler rockets, still giant, but smaller. And they would launch the moon probe in pieces. One piece that would go to the moon and orbit it, and another littler piece that would land on the moon. And because of that, you could use a smaller rocket. You could achieve your goal in time. The only problem was no one actually knew how to put ships together in orbit. It was a nice idea, it looked good on paper, it balanced the budget. We had no idea if it would work. Again, gutsy move. All right, so what happened next? Well, that summer we launched another astronaut into space. Exact same mission as Alan Shepard, but he went before he went. So he went in for 50 minutes, he came down. Unfortunately, this capsule was equipped with a special safety feature, an escape hatch that would blow. So normally you come out the top here, but there's also an escape hatch. So if it was broken or there was an emergency, you could push the button, go out the side. His problem, this is Gus Grissom, his problem was it blew by itself. And he fell out, and the capsule started to sink. And he started to sink. And the helicopter, of course, went to rescue the spacecraft. And it picked up the spacecraft, and the spacecraft was already too heavy. And it's already sinking into the ocean. The helicopter's sinking into the ocean. Meanwhile, Gus Grissom is drowning next to a space capsule. So finally, they let the thing go because they can't keep it. And finally, they picked this poor, exhausted, wet astronaut, wetter than Alan Shepard was, and saved him. And for a while, this astronaut had a cloud over him. They were like, did he freak out? Did he push the button himself? Did he fail? Eventually, everyone's like, you know what? This is Gus Grissom. He's been in test planes that were much wonkier than this one, and it doesn't make sense that he would have done this. And eventually, he was cleared and became a very important astronaut. But for a little while, there was some doubt. 20 years later, they pulled this thing up from the bottom of the ocean and probably cleared Grissom. Either way, you're going to find out it doesn't matter very much. All right, so we made it into orbit, or we made it into space twice. We're obviously winning this race, right? Well, Soviets launched this guy, German Titov. Soviets had this great thing. You go into space, you get an immediate promotion. We didn't do that. We should have done that. Not like we had trouble finding people to do it. So German Titov not only went into orbit, but he was in orbit for an entire day. We've been into space 5 minutes. He's been there entire day. We're like, great. And the problem is we had several more Mercury flights planned, but none of them were going to last a day, not for a while. In fact, we didn't even know if the rocket that could carry Mercury astronauts in orbit would work. Because remember, what were these rockets used for before it was people? It was for nuclear weapons, right? These are missiles. It didn't matter if 1 in 20 blew up on the launch pad, right? 5% chance of blowing up, that's okay. If you're a general, if you're the guy sitting on top of the rocket, not so good. So the missile they were going to use for the next astronaut, they had to make sure wasn't going to break. So it took months. Now the person they chose was John Glenn. And the reason they chose John Glenn as opposed to some other astronaut is he was the clean Marine. He was the all-American, big smile. He was the astronaut who didn't race fast cars. He had an old station wagon. There weren't rumors of him messing around with all the girls that had flocked to the Cape. He was the guy. And he waited for months while they got the bugs worked out of this Atlas rocket. At any time, the Soviets could have done something else that made us look bad. But in February 1962, this happened. This is a much bigger rocket, as you can see. This is an Atlas rocket, whose main job was to launch nuclear bombs. But in this case, it was launching John Glenn, who was sitting at the top, and he was going to go into orbit around the Earth 3 times. Now that's only 4.5 hours, but that's enough time. It cannot be overstated the effect this had on the national psyche. For once we could go, we did something. We are in this race. It's okay. That said, first John Glenn had to come back. There he is. Eating the first space food, these little cubes. So, at the beginning of his 3rd orbit, there was a little alarm that showed up in the NASA switchboard. It said that his landing bag, the thing that happens when the thing has already landed, it keeps the Mercury capsule upright so it doesn't tip over and everyone drowns, had been deployed already. All right, why is that bad? Well, next to the landing bag is the retro rocket. Behind the retro rocket is the heat shield that protects the ship when it's coming back in. There was a distinct possibility that upon re-entering the atmosphere, John Glenn would burn up. And America's triumph would become America's tragedy. Now, they didn't tell him about this. So on the ground, they're freaking out. They don't know what to do. Finally, they said, all right, we have an idea. Normally, when a Mercury capsule comes in, it jettisons the retro rockets. We won't do that this time. We'll leave it on, and we'll hope that the straps keep the heat shield in place. 5 minutes before Glenn's going to come back, they say, Mr. Glenn, please leave the retro rocket on. Why? Because your heat shield might come on. Thanks for telling me! Luckily, it worked. Either that or it was a false alarm all along, which is entirely possible. There are thousands of components, each made by the lowest bidder, by the way. And the result was electric. America was back in. American know-how, American ingenuity. The free world was in space. Not only that, but a few months later, we sent up another astronaut. Same mission. This is the hunky one. Another, just 3 orbits, but they wanted to make sure it was good. This guy, as he was coming back, his spacecraft was falling apart. He had to manually hit the button to hit the retro rockets. He ended up 250 miles off course. People thought he had drowned, was lost at sea. When they finally showed him, he was like offering space food to the divers who came to pick him up. He was like super chill. He ended up leaving the astronaut corps the next year after an accident and then became an aquanaut, someone who stayed underwater for weeks at a time. One of the very first people to do that. Well, not to be outdone, a few months later, the Soviets sent up this guy, Andrian Nikolaev. That's easy for me to say. First ethnic minority to go out space. He was a Chuvash, not a Russian. Okay, big deal, right? Well, they sent him 2 guys. So this is Pete Popovich. They sent up 2 of these spacecraft called Vostoks, which means east, because that's the direction they shot them. They sent them into orbit where they flew past each other, they waved at each other, apparently sang Russian folk songs to each other as they went past each other. It was very touching. And we went, ah! We sent a guy in space for 3 orbits. They're sending guys in space for days, and they're doing cartwheels with each other. We didn't know if they were actually even docking. Eventually we realized they were just sent close to each other. But we were like, wow, we are really far behind. Which made our next astronaut kind of pathetic. Yay, 6 orbits. So unexciting was this guy's flight, but it was the first space flight. This is the beginning of the space race. This is the first space flight that hardly got any coverage. I mean, it was on the front page, but it was like on the bottom right of the front page. This is not a big deal at the time. And yet it was a perfect flight. 6 orbits, no problem. Spacecraft didn't break. He landed as close to a carrier as anyone had ever got. All right, it's the end of 1962. Are the Soviets going to pull another rabbit out of the hat? No. Early 1963, this is Gordo Cooper, a man so chill, he fell asleep in the capsule and had to be woken up for the flight. Probably could have slept the entire flight. That's what I try to do when I fly overseas. I try to sleep the whole flight. He tried that, they woke him up. But I suppose they were paying him for this, so. Gordo Cooper was the first Mercury astronaut to fly an entire day in space. So 2 years after German teed off, we were finally catching up with the Mercury. So it was a big deal. He was the first astronaut to sleep in space, first astronaut to spend the whole day. By the end of the trip, the Mercury was falling apart. He had to land manually. He had to hit the button manually. Everything he had to do, he had to figure out how to steer the thing. As it turned out, without any automatics, with the radar broken, with everything falling apart, he actually got the best landing of all the Mercury astronauts. And if there was ever a case where it was good that we had qualified test pilots flying the thing, that was it. All right. So, that's the end of the Mercury program, right? Well, a month later, the Mercury astronauts and their wives ambushed Jack and said, could we please have a longer mission? Please, especially Alan Shepard, who said, look, I got 15 minutes. Can I please have a longer time? And Jack Kennedy was very polite, and then he picked up the phone and called Jim Webb, the head of NASA, and said, who the hell's running the show down there? Needless to say, it wasn't going to happen. And the reason why it wasn't going to happen is because we already had plans for our next space program. We had our Apollo space program, the one that was going to the moon. We had our Gemini program, which was a 2-person program in between to test out all those things we needed to make sure worked before we could get to the moon. Besides, it's not like the Soviets are going to beat us again so quickly. This is Colonel Baikovsky, and this is Valentina Tereshkova. She is significant for many reasons. One, first civilian into space, right? Not a military personnel. Second, you may notice, she's not a dude. She's a non-dude person. They were both in orbit for many days. They did the thing where they flew past each other. And this was tremendous. If you want to talk egg on our face, the Soviets had made space a place not just for military test pilots, but for everybody. Now, she was not just a common person. She knew how to parachute. That's why they picked her. Her hobby was parachuting. They said, we have a job for you. All right, so this is a big deal. She became an avatar of communism around the world, and she ultimately married the guy who went last time. The guy had trouble with the name, Andrei Nikolaev. It was the first astronaut marriage. They had a kid, and later they had a divorce. But, 50-50, right? All right, so what do we got in response? Well, not bad. This is what we had. This is Apollo at that time. That little rocket wasn't going anywhere. It was just testing the thing. That's how far behind we were. But we had this. So this is Gemini. Gemini's job, you'll notice it looks a lot like Mercury, doesn't it? Gemini's job was to send 2 people into orbit. But more than that, more than showing that we can send 2 people into orbit, it was to do all the maneuvering, the docking. Because remember, we want to send a spacecraft into orbit, dock it with the little lander, send both to the moon, split them up, land the lander, get the lander back up, which, by the way, is in 2 pieces already, so only take half the lander, attach it back to this thing in orbit, and then get the thing back to Earth. That's complicated. We didn't know if we could do it. We couldn't just go straight to Apollo. Plus, we wanted something in orbit before the Soviets made us look bad again. We didn't succeed. Late 1964, the Soviets send up Voskhod 1. And in Voskhod 1 were 3 astronauts palling around. Now, I know that sounds like a really cool thing. They sent 3 astronauts. Wow. They actually picked very small astronauts, and they crammed them in without parachutes. So they're lucky it worked. It was a stunt, but we didn't know that. At the time, it looked like they were going to be on the moon by 1966. Okay, well, maybe Gemini will be ready in time that we can... Nope. Next flight, Voskhod 1, early 1965. Alexei Leonov is the first man to spacewalk. He actually left his space capsule and hung around. Now, he came back and the press said it was amazing, it was super easy. It was like a walk in the park, it was wonderful. What they didn't say is, one, he pooped his pants. Which I would have, before we left the ground. But beyond that, he almost died. He was trying to get back in. His suit had inflated because it was pressurized. And they couldn't fit him back inside the space capsule. There were only 2, by the way, him and the other guy. Because 3 they couldn't have fit the suit. But we didn't know that at the time. Again, Soviets looked like they were totally beating us. What did we do in response? Gus and John Young went up in Gemini 3. They weren't up for very long, but at least they proved that the spacecraft worked. All right, great. Are the Soviets going to beat us again? Are they going to, was Voskhod 3 going to go up? And are they going to do tap dance? Are they going to send reindeer? And what are they going to do? Well, as it turned out, we had a little reprieve. Because the next space flight, 1965, was ours. And we have much better pictures. This is Ed White making the very first American spacewalk. He also had trouble in orbit. But in the end, he was able to get back in. You see this cool little gun he's got here that's actually squirts gas so he can maneuver around in orbit. And this little thing is called an umbilical, and it carries oxygen to it. With Ed White, we knew that someone could leave a spacecraft. And this was important because, one, walking on the moon involves going where there's no air in a spacesuit. So this was the first time we ever did this kind of thing. But also, if you need to repair a spacecraft in orbit, you need to do some sort of physical manipulation, we need to know that you can even leave the safety of your ship. He proved that. All right, great. The Soviets going to beat us? Again? No. Again, 1965, Gemini 5, we sent 2 people into space for 8 days. Let me tell you, it was a bit whiffy in there when they were done. The astronauts have talked about how their long endurance missions in Gemini were the worst experiences of their life. Because imagine being crammed into a Volkswagen Bug, but who doesn't shower for 2 weeks, and he poops in his chair. So these astronauts really got to get the credit they deserve. 8 days. We have busted all the records. We've sent 2 people in the same spacecraft. We're actually on a similar footing to the Soviets, which, they could beat us at any time. But now it's starting to look pretty good for the United States. Meanwhile, Apollo is continuing apace. The big Saturn rocket is going through its paces and working out okay. Things are looking all right in the mid-60s. And by this time, by the way, so here we are in the comfort of 2019, and we remember this space race as this super exciting time where everybody was rah-rah for space to beat the Soviets. But in fact, by this time, people were getting bored with the space race, wondering why we're spending this money in space when we should be spending it on Earth. We've got civil rights issues, we've got riots, we've got this war heating up in Southeast Asia. Why are we wasting this money on space? And several times, it came to Congress, and Congress said, we want to cut funding. Luckily, there were people who were fans of the space program, including our new president, because President Kennedy had been shot in '63. President Johnson was a big fan of the space program. As a result, we maintained our funding through the '60s, but it was never easy. A few months later, and this exciting thing happens, we send up 2 spacecraft, Gemini 6, Gemini 7, including Wally Schirra, who is one of the Mercury astronauts. What's super cool about this, you see how close these guys are? They got within a foot of each other. This was not math on the ground that got them in close orbits. They actually maneuvered right next to each other. If they had the ability, they would have docked with each other. And all of a sudden, we were really ahead of the Russians because we had 4 people in orbit and we were getting them close to each other. Momentum was on our side. But did the Soviets have a trick up their sleeve? No. We're still doing okay. 1966. This is a little adapter. Our job was to get in this Gemini and dock with this end. This had a big rocket on it. It would thrust us up hundreds of miles. This was to simulate what it'd be like to get into a rocket and head towards the moon. The guy who was on this mission was a guy who'd been an X-15 pilot, obscure aviator named Neil Armstrong on his first flight. So they docked with the thing immediately broke and started shooting out propellant, and they were spinning around, and they were in danger of like blacking out. They were spinning around so fast. They had to disengage and end the mission early. So a qualified success, to say the least. That's okay. Shortly thereafter, they launched another one and another Gemini crew. Unfortunately, you can't dock with that. So this is the top of the rocket. It was supposed to come loose. As you can see, it did not. They called this the angry alligator. And they got it close and they said, we can't dock with this thing. And they came back. Again, a qualified success. So it would be up to the next mission to succeed. Would they succeed before the Soviets managed their next flight? Yes. Gemini 10. The first time a Gemini was able to dock with an Agena, that's what that's called, and take it up to a higher orbit. Really cool. Not only that did they would dock with it, but then just for funsies, they went and rendezvoused with the earlier ones just to go, hey, there you are, still there, cool, don't ever change. This was exciting. We were now basically doing space docking routinely. All right, but we still had some things to test out. For one thing, no one had ever been in space for a long time. And if you're going to work on stuff in space, you have to be able to be in space for hours on end. You got to be able to manipulate things with your padded gloves. And up to this time, people were having real trouble. They go into space and they get exhausted because you're fighting this clumsy spacesuit. Things don't work. You're clinging to things because otherwise you float away. It's hot. It's not fun, although it's probably better than sitting with the stinky guy. Gemini 11. They had a little fun thing. You ever play tug of war? So they did tug of war. They attached a tether to the Agena, attached a tether to the Gemini, and spun them around each other for fun. Actually, it was really cool. It's the first time that artificial gravity was created in space, right? Because when you spin things, you get pulled. It's like in the spinner wheel at the carnival. So they got to do that, and they actually created a tiny little bit of gravity and proved the technique. Still, he got tired. It didn't work out. There was one more Gemini mission planned. And on this mission, this fellow was actually able to be outside the spacecraft and working for 2 hours. And with that, America declared, we have met all of our goals of the Gemini space program. When you think about it, that's pretty amazing. 10 flights. There were only 6 Mercury flights. There were already 10 Gemini flights. And by this time, it's almost like, the daily commute. There's a mission every few months. They work. Soviets have been awfully quiet. And we were ready for the next stage. We were so cocky that by early 1967, we were planning the first Apollo mission. This mission would go into orbit, would test the Apollo, and by the end of the year, who knows, we could be on the moon. Soviets have been quiet for years, and we're just winning. We had what was called go fever. And we sent these 3 people into an Apollo for a test. They've done it before. So we've got Gus Grissom, we know him, and Gus Grissom's great. So all the Mercury capsules were named, right? You had Friendship 7 was Glenn's, Freedom 7 was Shepard's, Grissom's was Liberty Bell 7, Gordo Cooper's was Faith 7. And they didn't like that name because they were worried about the headlines if the ship had crashed. It would say, America loses faith. So Gus Grissom, after his incident with his capsule leaking, decided he wanted to name Gemini 3 Molly Brown. You guys may not know who Molly Brown was. Molly Brown was an actual person who made it from the sinking Titanic. And they made a musical about her, which was big in the early 60s, called The Unsinkable Molly Brown. So obviously, if you name your spaceship after it, it's not going to sink. NASA hated that name. They thought it was undignified. And Gus Grissom said, fine, I'll call it the Titanic. And they said, all right, you can have this one. But after that, they didn't name any of the future Gemini capsules. That was their little revenge. All right. Apollo 1. It's January 1967. We've not only got Gus Grissom, we've got Ed White, who was the first spacewalker, and we have a new astronaut named Roger Chaffee. And they're all doing tests inside. Gus Grissom has been complaining about the shoddiness of construction for some time. The atmosphere inside Apollo 1 is pure oxygen, because it's easier to handle pure oxygen than air. Soviets used air. We used pure oxygen at a lower density. And into their test, not long before they were going to get up and go and get dinner, a fire broke out. And in pure oxygen, this fire consumed the capsule, and they were dead in 12 seconds. It would have taken 30 seconds just to get out. This was a tremendous blow. Everything stopped in its tracks. Johnson made a speech to Congress. NASA made a big analysis of what was going on. The Apollo program basically stopped for a year and a half while they checked and rechecked everything and made sure this could not happen again. And it was the right thing to do. The problem was we weren't the only ones in this space race. A few months later, the Soviets launched Soyuz 1. Now this is an interesting approach to the space program. You notice it doesn't look anything like the Apollo. It's got this little capsule up front. This is where the people normally sit. And the cool thing about the Soyuz, it was modular. You could send it into orbit and do science with this one, or you could send it without this thing to the moon, maybe attach a little lander to it. So the fact that the Russians were using these modular spacecraft showed that they had a sophistication and that they weren't aiming for the moon, while we were stuck on the ground trying to figure out how to keep people from dying on their way to the moon. Soviets are clearly ahead, right? Unfortunately, on his way down, the first astronaut to fly in Soyuz 1, Komarov was his name, his parachute didn't open. And Soyuz 1 crashed into the Siberian wastes, and there was nothing left of him when it was done. Here's his funeral. So the Soviets have their own delay, because they have to figure out how to make their moon probe without killing their astronauts. But this is a big deal, right? Until this time, we'd sent up astronauts, and there have been some near scrapes, but no one had gotten close to death. Now, on both sides of the Atlantic, 4 people have lost their lives. This is a big deal. All right, 1968. America's gotten done with its refurbishing of its space program. We have no idea where the Soviets are. The question is, who is going to get their moon program back into space first? Any guesses? Anybody know the answer? Yes, it's a trick question. The Soviets send Zond 5 around the moon and back. You'll notice it looks just like the Soyuz, but without the tip. The idea is you have 2 people in there, and they go around the moon, take pictures, and come back. They can't land on the moon, but it's still a huge feat of Soviet engineering. It should have been a flight that would have rocked the world. There's only one problem: no people in it. It was sent to the moon without anybody on board, some biological samples, because they didn't trust the spacecraft enough, and rightfully so. They had a problem in getting it back to Earth after it was coming through the atmosphere, so they didn't send people on board. As a result, the first moon program, moon spaceflight that worked, was Apollo 7. Why so many numbers? There were a bunch of uncrewed test flights, including just one of the Saturn rocket. Apollo 7 went commanded by Wally Schirra. He's the only astronaut to have flown a Mercury, a Gemini, and an Apollo. And he got super sick while he was in orbit. He and his 2 guys got sick, and he was very cranky, and apparently that's part of the reason why he was ultimately never landed on the moon, because he was very cranky in orbit because he got sick. I don't think that's fair, but that's the way it worked. By the way, Wally Schirra used to live in Rancho Santa Fe. And when I was learning how to fly a plane, my flight instructor used to serve him drinks at the local restaurant. So I'm 1 degree of separation from Wally Schirra. All right, that's cool. 1968, you have to understand, was a pivotal year in American history. First off, we've got a presidential election. Johnson has decided he's not going to run again because the Vietnam War is so hot and so controversial that he can't win. There are people rioting in front of the Democratic convention saying, LBJ, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, was assassinated in June. Martin Luther King, the civil rights luminary, was assassinated. It was a terrible, terrible year with violence and strife. And about the only thing that could save it was Apollo 8. Right around Christmas, we sent up an Apollo mission around the moon. And we didn't have to do it, but we did it because it was important to send a symbol of American know-how around the moon. And this is the first picture of the Earth taken from behind the moon. This is an Earthrise, the first one taken from space. And 3 astronauts in Apollo 8, they read from the book of Genesis on Christmas Day, and they got a flood of letters saying, thank you, you saved 1968. So now we come into 1969, and this is where we stand in the space race. We sent a person around the orbit, but we haven't tested the lunar lander yet. The Soviets clearly have the ability to send stuff in orbit around the moon, although they haven't sent people yet. It's anybody's game. Who gets the next step? We do. So this unprepossessing little thing is called a LEM, Lunar Excursion Module. And it's no coincidence that my daughter's initials are actually LEM. And she has a little model of the LEM in her room. So Apollo 9 went into orbit, and they had names, by the way. This is, I believe this is Charlie Brown and Snoopy. So they had to have names because they were separated from each other. And NASA's like, fine, but make them dignified. They said Charlie Brown and Snoopy. And what they did was they sent up an Apollo spacecraft. They sent up, and the LEM. They were attached to each other. One guy got into it. They separated, and then they docked back together. Proved that could work. This is an Earth orbit, by the way. They haven't gone to the moon yet, but this proved that both spacecraft work. This is actually a really neat spacecraft because you'll notice, unlike every other spacecraft, it's not streamlined. It's designed only for space. This thing can never land on a planet with an atmosphere. It is the first true spaceship. All right? A few months later, it gets sent to the moon. Apollo 10 was a dry run for the moon landing. In fact, they made sure they didn't have enough gas to land on the moon and go back up because they were afraid the astronauts would say, let's go the whole way. But they went to lunar orbit, they separated, they did all the things, and they did everything but land. We were primed, unless the Soviets beat us first. And in July 1969, as Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were getting into their spacecraft to go to the moon, we weren't sure if the Soviets were going to beat us first. There had already been a movie that came out a couple years ago where the Soviets made it first, although their guy died on the moon. July 1969, who's going to win? Well, you guys all know the answer to that one. One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. And we made it to the moon. And by the way, if anyone ever asks you, how do you know we actually made it to the moon? Radiation belts around the Earth and they can kill you and stuff. And this is how I always answer. Have you ever been able to keep a secret in your life? Has there ever been a time when you haven't been able to keep a secret? Now imagine if 1 million people know the secret. Do you think they can all keep the secret? And no one has ever been able to answer that one. All right. So where are we now? So it's 1969 and we've landed on the moon. I'm going to fast forward now because we ultimately went to the moon 6 times. We tried for 7. If you've seen the movie Apollo 13, you know what happened with that one. It was ultimately a success story, but it almost wasn't. 6 times on the moon, 2 people walked on the moon. The last time we sent a geologist, and then they came back, and we haven't been back since. Why did we bother? The Soviets, by the way, after we landed on the moon, said, we were never really in the race anyway. Good job, you guys. And they launched space stations. Good for them. Well, let me tell you why we went to the moon. There were a couple of reasons. One, morale. We had to show the Soviets that we were good at something. And by sending missiles and people to the moon, by proxy, we were showing that American know-how, that democracy, that our engineering was superior. And this was important not just to show the Soviets, but the rest of the world, that there was an advantage to being an American. Also, there was the scientific bonanza. They brought back hundreds of pounds of moon rocks, and we learned a lot of things about the moon from that. For instance, that the moon probably was a piece of the Pacific Ocean that got carved out when a Mars-sized planet hit the Earth about 4 billion years ago. And the moon is actually a little piece of the Earth. That was pretty neat. But more importantly is the things you learn along the way when you have a giant scientific endeavor. So for instance, pacemakers. These little things that electrically regulate your heartbeat when your heart can't figure it out anymore. That came from the knowledge it takes to run something remotely from thousands of miles away. And the miniaturization it takes to put a moon lander on top of a rocket that's smaller than the Russians. Cordless power drills. These little hand-powered equipment that used high-powered batteries, these things came from the space program. Tools that you need on a Gemini to make sure that you can repair parts, that you can weld things together. Direct. This looks like fun. A fireproof material, right? They had to develop fireproof materials for the spacecraft, so we didn't have another Apollo 1 crisis. And these things can be used by race car drivers. This one's really neat. This fabric, that's spacesuit fabric. It's super light, super tough, lets the light in but not the heat. And you see this in all sorts of places. Okay, and I want to stress a point. I've been talking about the astronauts a lot, and the astronauts are like the stars of a TV show. They get all the press, right? But in fact, it takes thousands, ultimately tens of thousands, millions of people to launch a space program. It takes the people who make the spacecraft, who test the spacecraft, who design the spacecraft. It takes the people who run the tracking center so you can always talk to the astronauts. There were 24 of these space centers around the Earth. There had been none when the space race started. They had to build them. We had to build goodwill around the world because these were in other people's countries. And one failure in Bermuda kept Gordo Cooper on the launch pad for hours. One little failure of one piece of this giant equipment. It's not all one guy in one spacecraft. The mathematicians who figured out how to get us into space, who calculated the way to get into space. Did any of you see Hidden Figures? So this is Katherine Johnson, who obviously is one of the most famous of NASA's computers, who went on to do many more things. There were hundreds of people like her who did these calculations, who went from doing it by hand to being the first computer programmers. At the time, they were called computers. And when computers came into existence, the men, the engineers, didn't want to touch these things. That wasn't their job. Math was a girl's job. Amazing how times changed. Back in the 60s, programming was women's work. So you had all of these people, thousands of people, but in the late 60s, Richard Nixon, we're not going to go to the moon anymore. And he slashed the budget. And America said, that's right, that's what we should do. Vietnam's heated up, we're done. Let's spend the money at home. And the space program budget was slashed. But you still had NASA, and NASA had these millions of people involved in the space program. And any bureaucratic agency, more than its initial mission, its job is to stay alive. And so they said, well, we've got to come up with some project that keeps us going, and it can't be more Apollo missions because we're not doing that anymore. Those were canceled. So they said, well, let's come up with a reusable spacecraft, right? It'll ultimately be cheaper, and it'll get us into space to stay. And the Air Force said, that sounds pretty cool. Make it big enough to carry a payload, a military satellite, and we'll foot the bill for some of it. And what they came up with was this. Most of you know what this is. And probably most of you have fairly fond memories of this, honestly cool-looking spacecraft. It took a decade to develop, cost far more than it was ever supposed to, and never flew with the regularity that it was supposed to. And in the end, we lost 14 astronauts in it. The space shuttle, the problem with the space shuttle was we were committed to it because it used all the same launch pads and all the same people that Apollo did. But it couldn't do very much. All it could do was go into, if this is Earth, this is how high it went. Now, it was useful for building this, the International Space Station. the single most expensive single object that humanity has ever created. If you were to ask people, and I have a friend who built part of the space station. If you ask them what good has the ISS done, at best it has taught us how to work with other countries in building things. But in terms of scientific return, in terms of value for cost, it actually has not been terribly useful. And to add insult to injury, note what we're using to resupply it. Yes, that's the Russian Soyuz. Okay, well, I hear you say great. Well, but I heard we're going back to the moon. Aren't we going back to the moon? Didn't George Bush say something in 2004? We're going to Mars. Well, this spacecraft has been in development for 15 years. This is called Orion. And notice it looks a lot like Apollo. There's a reason, developed by a lot of the same people. If you had to ask me, if you wanted to lay money on whether this thing will ever fly, I would bet against it. And the reason why is this. By the way, we'll have a happy ending. But this is the sad part. As long as the way you get into space is you have a big can and you light what's in it's on fire and you use what's coming out of the butt to get into orbit using Newton's third law, it's going to cost a certain amount. And you cannot get that price below a certain amount per pound. It's very expensive. And no matter how much this guy says he can reduce the cost, the fact is maybe he can reduce it by a factor of 5. If you're really optimistic, by a factor of 10. That's not enough to get you and me and grandma into orbit for regular trips. It's just not cheap enough. I know you're thinking, great. I came out here for an hour just to have this guy totally kill my butts. Well, I want to tell you what keeps me going. And I'm going to give you a little hope. So first off is, you don't need people in space to have an amazing space program. I'm going to give you just a little sample of the satellites that are in orbit right now doing amazing things. There are far more than you think. These are just all the ones that have gone to the other planets. The Voyagers, Cassini, the Pluto Explorer, tons. Just to Mars alone, we sent the Vikings in the 70s. We've sent half a dozen rovers, a bunch of orbiters. We have learned more about the planets than we could ever have dreamed 100 years ago. That's just one example. This is UWISE. UWISE is the sequel to WISE. You guys probably have never heard of WISE. WISE is an infrared telescope, and its job is to look for things that you can't see. And as a result of looking all around the Earth, it has found stars that were too dim for people to see with telescopes. It has discovered comets and planets around other systems. It has given us an idea of how fast the universe is growing and the history of the universe 15 billion years ago. It's an eye towards all that. I mean, it's made a comprehensive map of everything around our solar system. You guys didn't even know. Or this guy, the Orbiting Carbon Observatory. Its job is to see how much carbon dioxide is in our atmosphere. Because despite what some people say, there is a correlation between carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and how hot it gets. Or this guy, called SMAP. SMAP, I didn't even know about SMAP before I did this research, and I know a lot of things. SMAP's job is to measure soil, like how much water is being retained. This is the kind of thing that's super critical if you're a country that grows things. You want to know the long-term trends of climate change, how soil is being utilized. This kind of thing gives you the data you need to make those decisions, understand what's going on. This is Spitzer. This one is a huge telescope. It's in the same class as Hubble, which you may have heard of. And it's also an infrared telescope. It's discovered all sorts of things. It's still in operation. This one's one of my favorites. This is ACE. ACE's job is to look at the sun, measure all the particles that are coming out from the sun, and tell us what's going on, figuring how the sun affects the Earth long term. This guy has been in orbit for 20 years. And I happen to know the guy who runs the science on it. They put out reports, they're all like up to report 200. That's how long this thing has been in orbit. Just one of the many probes. And this is my favorite. This is TESS. TESS has one job. TESS orbits the Earth and looks at every star around us and looks for other planets around other stars. And it's already started to find them. And within the next 10 years, we're going to have a map and know where all the interesting stars are, with the interesting planets that might have life on them. Now, that sounds pretty ambitious, right? We can't even get back to the moon. So let me offer you this. It's true. Right now, the way technology stands, we're stuck on Earth. Right? Maybe we go up to the International Space Station if we're lucky or rich enough. But the original space program came out of an accident. We were building missiles to hit each other and kill each other. And we realized, hey, we can use this for some peaceful scientific endeavor. There's all sorts of technologies being developed today, whether it's the latest edition of Candy Crush, or it's something that makes your car drive better, or your drones fly better, or your computers communicate faster. Some bit of technology is going to happen. Mark my words, I'll put money on this, within the next 50 years, and it will be a natural side effect to go back into space. For instance, maybe we develop some sort of super strong material such that we can anchor a thread of this stuff somewhere on the equator, put the other end in a satellite around the Earth at a place where its orbit takes as long as a day, so it always looks like it's in the same place in the sky. And then you build an elevator. You only have to get to orbit once, and then the cost of going into orbit is the cost of pedaling a bicycle 100 miles, or whatever. This is an orbital elevator. Obviously, this is an illustration. We don't have them yet. But we know how to build them once we have the materials to do it. Or, who knows? Maybe we'll invent anti-gravity. Sounds crazy, but 150 years ago, nobody knew about relativity. You never know. So I firmly believe that sometime within the next 50 to 100 years, so maybe not anybody in this room, maybe you will see the way we get into space, and suddenly space will be cheap enough for everybody, not just an elite few. So I hope you've enjoyed this performance. I hope you learned a bit about how we got to the moon, what going to the moon has done for us, and if we're not going to the moon right now, some of the cool things that are still happening despite that, and some ways that we might ultimately end up getting there. And if you enjoyed this show, it was brought to you by, go ahead and stick that in your phones. We update it every 2 days, and I promise you it's super cool.
Take a picture.
Thank you very much. And, I got plenty of time, so if you have any questions, go ahead. And I noticed everyone who said they had to leave early, no one left. So I'm very grateful to librarians who locked the doors so you couldn't leave.
Go, Brandon. Go, Brandon.
Does anyone have any questions?
I've heard some statements about how serious radiation is. Say someone wants to go to Mars, or even to the moon, particularly to the Mars. How serious is radiation for the astronaut?
It absolutely is a big deal. So, as far as going to the moon, not so big a deal. So you've got the Earth. I wish I had a picture of the Van Allen belts, but I took it out for time. Here's the Earth. The Van Allen belts actually look like a twin donut. And then you got the moon over here. You can actually launch a trajectory such that you only go through these radiation belts for a short period of time. That said, the sun is still pumping out tons of radiation, actually particles like electrons and protons shooting out from the sun. And long-term exposure can be dangerous. Satellites fry out as a result of it. And long-term exposure to people can cause sterility, can cause cancer, and ultimately can cause other problems, cataracts, whatever. So you have to have some kind of shielding, not just for you, but for your equipment. Equipment's a little easier than people, because you can build redundant components onto equipment, not so much people. It's a factor. You can shield your ship both with matter and with electromagnetics. Like you can put a big magnet around your spaceship and that'll trap the particles before they can go in. But yeah, it's an issue. I have read articles that say we actually cannot go to Mars with our current technology because we would be too long in a dangerous place. Whereas the International Space Station is actually under the radiation belts, which traps a lot of that dangerous radiation. So your answer is as good as mine. I know all those people who say we're going to go to Mars for this trip. It's a one-way trip, and they may not make it all the way. But once we have that technology that makes it faster to go into space, then it stops being such a big deal. Any other questions?
Did I hear you say Neil Armstrong said one small step for any human?
you say?
Well, if you listen really hard, you can hear him say it the right way. And I don't want to fault a guy who trained for years, flew tons of spacecraft, landed on the moon, only to flub the first thing he ever said. So yes, a little bit of revisionist history on that's what he meant to say. But yes, you're right. If you listen carefully, yes. Actually, it sounds like one small step for man, one giant leap for...
I heard that it was just that the sound equipment dropped briefly, and that's why you didn't hear the A.
There was all sorts of excuses made. As far as I understand, we really did club the line. And, you know, to his credit, it was kind of an exciting time.
I thought it.
And the interesting thing about Neil Armstrong is, so Buzz Aldrin is a super outgoing, extroverted guy. He goes to all these events. He was the second guy on the moon. You know, what it might have been. I don't think it was him who said it. That might have been a small leap for Neil, but it was a big jump for me. I think that might have been the next. That might have been Alan Bean. But Buzz Aldrin is a super outgoing guy. Neil Armstrong is actually quite introverted. He passed away not long ago. So I could totally see him having stage fright, coming off this ladder in this totally new world. It's like, I gotta save the line, gotta save the line. Also gotta make it on the moon and not crash. Okay.
I would have been like, yeah!
Yeah, go to the Onion website and they have the truth. It's a
Safe
joke and
for,
it's not safe for work.
children. But it's very fun.
Do we know the animals that went in space, did they like it? Is there any way we can know if they enjoyed it or not?
So here's an interesting thing. Long term, spiders get used to it. So spiders, when we sent them up into space, at first they spun these webs and they were like all over the place. And after a few days, they're like, all right, I'm just gonna pick, this is gonna be my up. And this is how I'm gonna make my web. And by a week, they were making spider webs that looked normal. The French sent cats into space. My cat doesn't like to be in a car. I'm pretty sure these cats weren't having fun. When we sent one of our chimpanauts into orbit, he had this thing, right? He got pellets when he did the right thing, he got shocks in his feet when he did the wrong thing. I believe they removed the system when they put people in there. Anyway, one of the chimpanauts, the thing short-circuited, kept shocking him even though he was doing the right thing. So I can tell you, he did not enjoy his job. As for the dogs, some of them didn't make it back. Others, dogs are pretty versatile creatures, and I'm sure they were happy once they got back. They got doggy treats, got to live in the White House. So, ultimately it's okay. Any other questions? Any kind of space-related thing? No? We're good? Thank you very much. Check out the site. Feel free to contact me. I love meeting people, and if you have any other opportunities like this that you think could use a space-based or historical presenter, please let me know. Thank you very much.
First, I want to say thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate being around other people who are excited about this anniversary. And we have a special astronaut, very quiet, actually could be a woman, person hasn't said yet. And you can take your picture on the moon by our astronaut. Also, we're going to be raffling off we've got some front page newspapers, and if I can have my two assistants,